Hello, welcome to the 50-minute hour. This is Cory. I'm here today with my friends.
Hey, it's Calvin.
And it's Jacob.
And what are we drinking today, boys?
Not exactly sure. Jacob, do you know what it is?
It was made by Jay-Z, I believe.
Some sort of rapper hip-hop artist. Yeah, it's Cognac, or as we say in Kentucky, or Cognac, which is basically just fortified wine, from what I understand. And it's Douce, and we have a nice Romanian Orthodox cross on it. I like to put my holy oil in the jars that I use. See, I got one down there, and I'm also smoking some Kentucky Burley from Fayette County Cigar Store on East Main, Lexington, Kentucky.
Schwab's or
no? It's just on East Main Street. I walk there, which is why I like it, and the tobacco's cheaper.
Very nice.
Although they recently put their prices up. Schwab's takes better care of their tobacco. So, but I like the guy who works at Fayette County Co. And they don't require a mask.
Have you ever grown your own tobacco? Because I know that's popular in Kentucky because our soil is kind of trash and is good for tobacco because it's got gravel in it.
I feel like there's laws and regulations to that. I haven't tried. I've recently been interested in making my own shisha from tobacco, though, from just raw tobacco and putting it with honey and maybe a few distilled berries for hookah smoking. But that doesn't require growing it. But I don't know if you can just like go out and grow tobacco. It's probably something I mean, you can't really even touch the leaves with your bare hands. You'll get poisoned.
And what pipe are you using?
This pipe is I don't know the lingo for what sort of it's big bowl and short stem that's curved at the tip, wooden, very used, around 10 20 years old. It was given to me by a witch whose father is a rabbi, and it was originally his pipe.
Was this the same one who made a voodoo doll?
No, that
Okay.
was another witch friend. For whatever reason, I attract witches, but occult people in general. But
Of course. So I think before we get into this podcast, we had a couple points we wanted to reiterate on from the last podcast.
yeah, errata. I just kind of talk quickly sometimes, so I get things wrong. And if you notice I get something wrong, just point it out, and we'll address it in the future podcast. So regarding the last one, I'd spoken about a Mr. Mark Larimore being the photographer I was speaking about. That is not the case. It's Mark Lafia was the photographer. Mark Larimore was a religious scholar at the New School who specialized in Job. He was a great guy. I mean, I really liked him. Also, when I was talking about a passage that I thought was from the New Testament, maybe it's quoted in the New Testament, but the passage was more or less, it's from Psalm 127. What would that be, 126 in the Septuagint or something?
Yes.
Something like that. Okay. And basically that if the workers build the house, they labor in vain without God, or something to that effect. So It's a Dangerous Method was the film where Freud has the cigar going into New York City with the Statue of Liberty's uterus. It's Pete's Coffee was what we were drinking, not Nate's coffee. Or sorry, Nate's Coffee is what is local, what I thought we were drinking. What we were drinking is Pete's Coffee. Very different. Okay. And then the hymn I mentioned at the end was the hymn to Mary. The name is Salve Regina, but there's multiple Salve Reginas. So all I can say, it's usually sung in Latin. It was very big before Vatican II. And it's usually sung at Compline in monastic cultures in the Catholic Church.
All right, on the comment section, there was one more. It says, I never answered why I got involved in psychoanalysis from an early age. So I think we could just start off this one by talking about that, answering that question that you asked yourself, basically.
Yeah, I mean, basically, since I was 5 or 6, I was interested in the fact that I was very different from other people. And one particular aspect was that I did not really have any familial or emotional connection to my family. I did have emotional connections to friends, but not to family. So I remember being in like kindergarten and being kind of freaked out by the fact that kids were hugging their parents. It just seemed odd to me, or like kissing their parents. And and I didn't understand why. It didn't really make sense to me, and I was like, there's something very different about me. I had several intuitions at a very early age about nature and reality, some of which I agree with still, some of which I don't. One of them, for example, was the idea that man came from apes. And then I remember I was 7, and a friend told me that when I told them this, they were like, well, someone already said that, Darwin. And I got really pissed off. So maybe if you want to psychoanalyze me, that's why I hate evolution today. But another intuition I had, which may sound strange that I was 6, but another intuition I had was that the reason I'm very different from other people has something to do with sexology. So I became very interested in reading sexology textbooks in when I was 7 or 8. I would just find them at the library or wherever. And I found them very boring, though. They weren't really what I was looking for. And so I started going more into psychology in general. Again, it was too reductionistic. It wasn't until somewhere in middle school and then especially in high school, I think I mentioned in high school, we started an independent psychoanalysis class. I finally found Freud, and along with Plato, more or less simultaneously. There was a really good book I read comparing C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud's life. I can't remember the author. If you just look up book C.S. Lewis Freud, it'll come up. But it was a really good book, and that sort of put me on the projection for realizing that even if psychoanalysis was invented by an atheist materialist, it was much more substantially open to metaphysics than pretty much any other modern school of psychology. Even in a sort of counterintuitive way, even Jungian psychology, which I know would surprise a lot of people, and I could talk about that at another point, maybe in this or another podcast. But the other thing, I mean, you'll find books like "Why Was Freud Wrong" by I can't remember his name, but he was a Christian author. I think he was Catholic, and he makes a very strong point that you're basically lying to yourself if you think psychoanalysis can be in any shape or form metaphysical, because Freud himself was an atheist materialist. And my point is that, well, Freud was an atheist materialist against his own best intentions. There's a great book by a Catholic psychoanalyst, Paul C. Vitz, called Freud's Christian Unconscious, that if you want to sort of rebuttal to that argument, you could check out. But in either case, my point being is, like, I was very disillusioned. I was weirded out and disillusioned with kids around me and most adults around me. And I realized I was pretty different from most people. And I was also disillusioned for most of the answers I was coming across as to why that was. And it was in psychoanalysis that I really found my answer. So
there you have it. And for those interested, the book that Cory's talking about is called The Question of God. C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud debate God, love, sex, and the meaning of life. And that's by Armand Nicoli.
Yep. Thank you, Jacob.
So I believe you once told me that in order to become a psychoanalyst, you have to be psychoanalyzed yourself.
Yeah, everyone except Freud. Yes, Freud advocated that one go through psychoanalysis. And the reason, again, what you really learn in psychoanalytic training is how to deal with transference and countertransference, which we have been talking about in the Freud class. Well, you weren't there, but if you did the readings, you would see that we were talking about it. And basically, transference is when you take these experiences you've had in early childhood, especially with parents, brothers, sisters, and you unconsciously project them onto other people in your daily life. This happens daily, very casually, but sometimes it gets serious and out of hand. And the idea behind the psychoanalyst and traditional psychoanalytic therapy is that they're mostly a blank slate. They're a mirror, they're a wall, and they don't really say much. Generally, psychoanalysts are very careful to not put too much information about them online, so that their patients don't learn too much about them, because all this gets in the way of maximizing the culture of transference, which is what the analyst is really dealing with. Because psychoanalysis is dealing with the unconscious, you can't just ask someone, what's your unconscious thoughts, because they don't know. So you deal a lot of that, through dreams being one, but the other one is that they project all these unconscious transference onto you as a therapist, and you maximize it because they don't really know much about you, yet they're spending, again, in traditional psychoanalysis, you're going to your therapist 4 or 5 times a week, an hour, 50-minute hour each. So that's 5 hours a week with this person who you don't really know anything about. So you're just putting all this unconscious garbage on them. Now, the analyst has to do with their own countertransference, and the more thorough their analysis themselves were, the more they've become conscious of their own transference, and therefore the better they're able to deal with that in the relationship. Now, generally, just getting to the point in psychoanalysis where you're even dealing with the transference can take a year to 2, maybe 3 years in some cases. Woody Allen once said he was like in analysis for like 10 years. And I was like, something's wrong. Something's going on. And there are people who use analysis like a drug. I'm not an advocate of that. I mean, I think after a while, it's the analyst's responsibility to say, I think you're misusing psychoanalysis, or we're not compatible. I mean, the other thing Woody Allen said, he was like, he kept going into different therapists, or he had like, they were all women. And I was like, well, something's going on there. Like maybe try a male therapist or something. But, I mean, obviously, because that'll have effects in transference. Like you're transferring mostly unconscious feelings about your mother, or mostly unconscious feelings for your father. Now, very pre-Oedipally, right? I mean, these things are bisexual in the sense they exhibit unconscious information that you have coalesced from both sexes of the parents, or sisters or brothers or whatever. But in either case, sorry, what was I answering again? I got kind of
just talking about being psychoanalyzed yourself to become a psychoanalyst.
Yes. And so the idea, right, is that you're in the process of being psychoanalyzed, you're able to be more conscious of that transference and deal with it.
So you mentioned some people use psychoanalysis as a drug and just keep going. And you say that's not the appropriate way to use it. What do you think the most appropriate way to use it would be if you were wanting to get psychoanalyzed?
Yeah, this is a controversial question. I'm pretty Lacanian here. I think Lacan basically, who is an atheist, I mean, he sees psychoanalysis as fire fighting fire. Basically, what psychoanalysis does is what religion just did passively for most people throughout centuries. And now that everyone's secular, by which I mean, even if you are consciously religious, you still exhibit fundamentally secular behaviors that even skeptical people in religious cultures throughout most of history wouldn't exhibit. So we have a passive nature, or ideology, if you want to call it. And psychoanalysis and psychology, which are themselves just other ideologies, are sort of a means of how to deal with this post-industrial neuroses on the collective level. So what psychoanalysis is really doing is bringing the unconscious into the conscious so you can be more aware of how you're going to deal with your misery. This is why Freud says, for one, psychoanalysis is not meant for most people. It's meant for very few people who can handle their misery. Most people, for Freud, he's pretty Schopenhauer, and everyone is miserable whether or not they realize it. Life viewed, as Schopenhauer says, in parts and bits is like a comedy. We might say a sitcom, but viewed in the whole, it's a tragedy. And this is basically without exception for Freud. So most people can get by with their illusions, but some people, the illusions become so intense, they exhibit extremely neurotic behavior or hysterical behavior. And so that's where psychoanalysis comes in. And like, you might be a person who the very fact you're exhibiting this extreme reaction to this level of repression shows that you might be able to actually deal with being more self-aware about why you're actually fundamentally miserable. And so psychoanalysis is not some sort of like, oh, you're going to be happy, you take this medications, you do CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, and you're going to have good thoughts all the time. No, you're going to be just as miserable. But the sort of Socratic maxim behind psychoanalysis that at least in knowing yourself, your misery, embracing it, you have some sense where you're more so far truth itself is its own reward. To say of nothing else, basically. And that means psychoanalysis should basically come to a point where the patient by their own will leaves analysis. Now that can be premature, but ideally the therapist is able to work with the transference and countertransference in such a way adeptly and adroitly to get the patient to the point, or the analysand as we'd say, to the point where they're able to leave by their own volition when they feel they've completed analysis. Generally, I don't think that should take more than 5 years, with a few exceptions. If you have a good therapist, which is to say it's going to take much longer than pretty much any other form of therapy, which again is why it doesn't take very well to American ears, which is very much the fast solution medication route. But I think some people, you especially see this with celebrity culture. I think it's a part of the same reason that they get into things like Scientology, which feeds off a similar model, is this sort of narcissistic mirroring that psychoanalysis affords that can be extremely masturbatory. And I think people psychoanalysts as well as analysands get caught in this trap. And I think there's a lot of things Freud said that should be done that psychoanalysts don't do. I mean, one big thing he said, which surprises a lot of people, is that psychoanalysts should see any patient regardless of whether or not they have the financial means to afford it, if they are able to be analyzed. And Freud said that if you have someone who's homeless, basically, you know, you didn't literally say homeless, but so far that there is an important sense where something has to be sacrificed, but it doesn't have to be money. It could be a painting or something they find, or, you know, something that's valuable to them. The gift psychology is an important factor in psychoanalysis, but it doesn't have to be money. So just to say that there's a lot of things Freud said that should be done. Another thing is that basically medical students typically don't make good analysts. It's usually students who study humanities, and yet most psychoanalysts today come from a more medical background. So again, there's all these things Freud said that I think were great ideas that basically no one in this psychoanalysis is basically totally bougified now. I mean, I remember being in New York City, and it was all these women who were psychoanalysts who were basically trophy wives, and it was just something they did on the side. And I don't think they took it very seriously, but it was not that different to all these tarot readers I saw who, you know, being more immersed in a tradition of legitimate tarot, tarotology, whatever you want to call it. I found that most of these people were really just, total frauds, and basically were just doing it because their husbands were truckers, and they would just buy them this small place somewhere downtown or wherever, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and it was just a little thing for them to do on the side as a trophy wife job. And that's basically what, in many cases, psychoanalysis has become, is this sort of bourgeois profession that I don't think Freud ever intended it to be. But
so what would it take for you to psychoanalyze someone? Like, would you just psychoanalyze anyone in the grocery store if they asked you, if
No.
they just came up to you?
I mean, especially with the Freudian tradition, you need a lot of information that even friends of a person are not generally privy to. So it basically demands the therapeutic techniques of psychoanalysis, where you have the analyst sitting in a chair and the patient's lying down, not facing the analyst. Not all psychoanalysts practice this technique, but at the very least, you need someone in a context where they're telling you everything without censor.
Okay.
And even building that habit in most people, it takes about a year into psychoanalysis to get them past their censor. So it's a lot of work. It's not. Now, that being said, like every now and then someone might say something about their parents or like a dream they had, and based on other things I know about them, something starts clicking, and I'm like, but I don't. It's something you have to turn on, because it's not. In most cases, the technique requires a lot of mental energy. Like you feel tired after doing it. Like psychoanalysts, you see like 6 patients a day are usually very drained, which is good. That means they're probably doing their job well. They're not just being lazy asses or whatever. But it's not something you can just walk up to someone and do. Now, you can get in other directions like depth psychology with Jung, which in a certain sense is more superficial, by which I mean you don't have to know all these things about a person necessarily. They can just tell you a dream, and there are these collective archetypes that just immediately jump out to you. I think there's validity in that. I think I talked about this last time, but I'm not someone who sees Jung and Freud as, despite Jung and Freud themselves and Jungian and Freudians, for the most part, I don't see them as entirely contradictory, and I think you can hold both of what they claim to be true to some degree. But this is all to say that things that came out of Freud that weren't exactly Freudian psychoanalysis are more immediate when it comes to just doing everyday psychoanalysis on the street, I guess.
Okay. Now, do you get annoyed if people like ask you, like if you tell someone, yeah, I'm a psychoanalyst, or you've studied that, do you get annoyed if people just say, oh, can you psychoanalyze me?
No, I don't get annoyed.
Okay.
I mean, I like the enthusiasm. I just had to tell them like I probably can.
Okay.
You know, even especially actually if I'm friends with them, because that means there's all this countertransference I'd have to deal with, because I know too much about them. You know, not to say not what they know about me. That's going to make them, for one, people when they know more things about you, they're more likely to censor because they know what you like and don't like. They're like, oh, I don't want to say this because he doesn't like that. So, but it also works for my part. Like I have more countertransference about how I work with them, and I'm projecting my own problems onto them that I'm not able to deal with. So it's even more difficult. Now, Freud broke his own rules here. He had a patient who, I think it was the Rat Man, who told Freud he had fantasies about sexual relations with Freud's daughters. And, you know, Freud, being a good psychoanalyst, brought him out to eat dinner with his family. So, which apparently worked. I mean, so, you know, he knew what he was doing. But, Yeah.
How did that end? Do you know?
The Rat Man and the Wolf Man alike were a few of Freud. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy to this, so take it with a grain of salt. But at least the Wolf Man would answer all his future phone calls saying, Wolfman speaking, he was so proud of being cured by Freud. So that's the Wolfman's own testament. But obviously, there are people who within and without psychoanalysis that heavily criticize whether or not these treatments were effective. And the Rat Man, according to Freud's account, maybe other accounts, was at least partially cured, but very debated. This is not something most psychoanalysts would do today, especially if they're telling you they're having sexual fantasies of their family.
Why was he called the Rat Man?
The Rat Man.
Well, why?
It had to do with fantasies of rats going up his anus.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I was expecting that. Were you, Calvin?
I mean, I had some sort of idea that would be a little unusual, because it's a strange name, but a little different than what I was expecting.
Don't even ask about the Wolfman. No, I'm joking. Actually, it's much more innocent.
Gosh. Anyways, so I think that was a very thorough and very good explanation as for your interest in psychoanalysis.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for the sake of the podcast, we might want to move on to our topic for today.
Yes.
So for those who are interested, our topic for the day is going to be kind of pornography in our society today. And when we say pornography, we don't necessarily just mean, pictures or videos of lewd or nude people. We're talking more about this deeper idea that all imagery in our society today is pornographic in the sense that we're losing means of experience. So I don't know where we want to begin with that. If there's any questions you have, Calvin, going forward.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to define further what we mean by pornographic, because when you say pornographic, you have a picture in your mind of what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So several things. A part of this comes from a conversation we had at one of my Jacob's symposium. It was Jacob's first symposium. Hail. And the question that was being brought up was on photography in general. And I think I mentioned last podcast how I'm very into photography and not really actively practicing it for a variety of reasons. But basically what was brought up in the symposium was the problem of photography and why I'm a Platonist, supremacist elitist when it comes to photography, by which I mean I think very, very few people should have permission to have photography as a technology. So that's one part about what we're getting into. Pornography, which comes from the Greek porneia, right? That's what Christ uses when he's talking about sexual sins in many of the cases in the New Testament, is the word porneia, which is a very wide word. I mean, it can mean adultery. It can mean sexual perversion. It's a very catch-all term, but in a more wider sense, it could just mean a perversion in any way. It doesn't have to be sexual in its ideology. And so when we're talking about pornography of the image, we're talking about, one, the power that an image has over a person. Words are powerful, but images are even more powerful. This is very much the Jungian idea. And images are primal. So you have this power of the image that pretty much every culture has understood and held images in a very sacred context. And then around the turn of maybe the 12th or 13th century, we started to have a different philosophy of art. Pretty much all art or visual images were understood in a religious context up until around the West. There are some exceptions, but I'm speaking very generally. Obviously, you had graffiti in Pompeii of penises, but I would argue that even here, this is not dissected from religion in a conscious way, especially seeing that Pompeii's patron god, Priapus, was literally the god of huge dicks. So you can entirely even disconnect everyday graffiti from religion in the ancient world. So in that respect as well, what you see with the transformation into the Renaissance with perspectivism, realism, even here you see a lot of the images that the Renaissance artists are doing in a religious context that are funded by the Catholic Church or rich patrons for religious reasons. But the realism brings art into a new dimension where art is here and now. It's not something that is a window to the transcendent, like we would say with icons. It's something that is still degenerative of an iconographic purpose, but has become something more about for lack of a better word, collective narcissism. It's telling us about religion or gods or mythical creatures in a way that relates to us in the here, in the now, not in a transcendent realm. It's sort of a repaganization of the Western Christian trajectory, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. I think the problem is that art at this point becomes perverted. It becomes pornographic, by which I mean it becomes a power that is perverse and powerful to lead men towards other desires outside of immediate transcendental states. So that's what we're talking about with pornography.
Okay, that answers it.
Obviously, literal pornography is a very overt manifestation of this tendency, but in a way it's admirable insofar it's a very honest look at what art actually has become. I see pornography as in the same way I look at brutalism in architecture, which is to say brutalism has no facade. It has no lie. It has no dishonesty. It is telling you that God is dead. We live in a world where God is dead. This is the same thing that literal pornography is doing. It doesn't have any sort of modern art bourgeois pretension. It's very self-aware that God is dead, that there's no sacredness in sexuality, that there's no majesty in the relations between humans. In this sense, there's actually something very admirable about literal pornography. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying it's admirable. You know, like there's admirable villains or whatever. It's an anti-hero, a cultural anti-hero.
So I think before we delve more into this idea of a pornographic society, it'd be really good for especially our listeners who aren't Orthodox to really understand what an icon is and what an icon means in terms of an image in the religious sense. So
icons are not exclusive to Orthodoxy. Again, they're existent in virtually every religion. Obviously, when we talk about it, it's just Greek. It means image, right? Buddhists have them. Hindus have them. I have several icons in here of various religions. Some are Buddhist, some are African fetishes. An image can be 3D, right? You can have a statue of Mary, an African fertility fetish. I just collect various occult objects in my room. That's why I need so many actual Orthodox icons to balance the energies out. So in Orthodoxy, the specific theology that is particular to our iconographic theology is that icons emanate an energy of God, of the angels, of theosis energy. So you can have other icons like pornography, or I think most art nowadays that are actually exhibit a demonic energy. All images exhibit an energy or logoi. They could be corruption of logoi or a manifestation of logos. And these energies affect us, whether consciously or unconsciously, passively or actively. And so in Orthodoxy, we view icons as an entryway into the celestial, as an entryway into the transcendent. It's a point of meditation. Now, the icons themselves are not the object of worship. They're more like windows into worship. And even in prayer, you really just use icons as a centering point, not dissimilar to what Buddhists do with their icons, as a center for meditation. But eventually, in deeper prayer, you go beyond the icon and you go beyond all images. I mean, the church fathers say that the inevitable sin is idolatry. And what they mean by this is that with icons or without icons, like Protestants not using anything here aren't saved from this, that inevitably we are condemned to understanding God by cataphatic or affirmative actions and words. That is to say that we understand God as good or loving, but as Dionysius the Areopagite points out, that God is actually beyond all these things. Nevertheless, we need these idolatrous sort of images and concepts as like steps on a ladder to get to the great unknown, to that which is beyond being. This is not the God of philosophers that you can talk about linguistically. This is a God that totally transcends all images and knowledge that are available to the human thought. There's a sense in which we participate with that unknown beingness in heaven, in transcendence, in theosis, even in everyday life, in meditation and prayer, or through other people, through one's neighbor. That the unknowingness that is mystical in the sense you can't talk about it is emanated in these images being everyday people or icons. So in the Orthodox tradition, icons are sort of this center ground for our view of what beauty is, a view of what art is supposed to be, despite all these other images we have to interact with as modern Orthodox, and as an entryway into the soul of the saints, and which are all themselves parts of a mirror to the soul of God. We see through a glass darkly, as St. Paul says, and that darkness is much less obscure in the mirrors of saints, in the mirrors of angels. And that's what icons are. They're mirrors to the unknown God that we can't gaze upon directly.
So do you think there is some truth that an icon could turn into some sort of idol? Because I know several people who aren't Orthodox, they would be Protestant and don't have that, idea of an icon. And whenever they see someone, talk about an icon or have an icon or even go to a church where there are icons, they get very turned off immediately and say, oh, they're praying to the icons. Sort of like, I know some people who would say Catholics are praying to Mary and therefore it's idolatry, having another God. Do you think there's truth in that? Or do you think it's kind of a mix of both?
Certainly. Although I will say, psychologically speaking, if you're not doing this in a conscious way, you're going to do it unconsciously elsewhere.
Okay.
And I definitely think that generally Protestants are actually much more guilty of this, which is to say you'll find out more of idolatry relating to more conceptual things.
Okay.
Mammon, status, capitalism, politics. When you do things consciously in a religious context, it sacralizes this tendency to perversion, to porneia, that people are going to do inevitably. So icons actually end up acting up as a sponge for this tendency. If you don't have some physical, concrete way to center your meditation on the unknown, on the divine, on the mystical, you're going to do it in another way, and probably not in a way that's very healthy. So Protestants have some legitimacy in this criticism. You definitely do find people who worship the statue itself or the image itself. But I'm going to say that this is much more rare than it is for Protestants who make this criticism to fall into that trap themselves with more conceptual things.
Okay.
So I think one of the interesting points you made a couple minutes ago was how you feel like a lot of modern art or art today has this demonic or daimonic energy to it. Would you care to expound on that a little bit more?
Yes. I'm not saying, there's a Vice documentary on Agafia, who is a old calendar believer in Russia, in Siberia. And basically, there's a lot of history going on to what the old believers are, whether or not, to what degree, which of them are in schism or part of the Orthodox Church. Basically, just think of them as Amish Orthodox. And there's this girl named Agafia who's been the subject of several documentaries. And she's very interesting. It's worth looking at the Vice documentary on her. She's an old believer Orthodox. She uses a Bible that's like 800 years old. And in this Vice documentary, there's a scene that I really like where she's, the Vice documentarians are talking about, their thing being on television or whatever, or there's a television there. And she says, I don't want to look at it. Even to look at it is to invite demons in and to damn my soul. Now, that might seem very radical, but I actually don't think it's that far off. Another thing is that like a lot of boomers today will complain about kids and their cell phones and the internet, which, don't get me wrong, I understand entirely. But I actually think the boomers' minds have been much more rotted by television. Television is an extremely demonic entity. There's some sense in which the internet at least has an agency that makes your mind more conscious. When you're totally sitting back and the most activity you have an agency is flitting through the channels, you basically become what a patient is in psychoanalysis on the couch, which is to say zombified. You become unconscious. And your reason becomes backseated to whatever is being presented to you. This is the secular wisdom of psychoanalysis, which is that there are demons that lurk within us, and there are demons in the world, and only certain things have to be put into effect to hypnotize you to let those demons in, and to let the demons inside of you out, which is to say to let them control you. You cast one demon out and you take 7 in. So images participate in this spiritual world, no matter how mundane they might be. And when we surround ourselves with images, we're surrounding ourselves with energies that we let into ourselves consciously or unconsciously. And that passively affects the way we treat other people, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about our desires, who we think we are. I'm not saying necessarily that every single image or piece of art you encounter is demonically possessed.
Of course not. Yeah.
That may be the case in sometimes, but especially if you see some of the modern art in New York. But what I mean passively is that everything has participation energetically in God, and things by the will of the artist or the will of you have a participation in rejecting that godly aspect and emanating something that is against it, which is to say evil. It's a negation of God. Even the evil things, the evil substances, are still relying on the goodness of God, even existence itself, which we would understand as good. So there's nothing that's totally evil. In that same vein, you can take a totally evil object or almost asymptotically evil object like Lucifer and find something godly in it. So this is to say, again, that you're not going to become necessarily demonically energized by looking at images of modern art or television or whatever. It's just for the vast majority of the people, for most of the time, most of the images in everyday world are going to have more demonic effects than angelic effects. Based on where we are spiritually, which is dismal, and where the artists who are making these images are, which is dismal. It's very unlikely you're going to connect whatever is good in those and good in yourself to have a beneficial relation to them.
Now, tying back to, you said you like photography, but you don't practice for several reasons. Is that one of the reasons? Is you feel like you can't? Is it irresponsible to practice photography exactly?
Disagree to that. I mean, mostly it's pragmatic. It's
Okay.
When I was in New York City, I had access to a very cheap way of developing film that I no longer do. I'm thinking of even making a darkroom in my bathroom actually, and I might get back into it. I'm very abhorrent towards digital photography, and the reason is a part of it is that it makes it so easily accessible. I think photography, like any art, should be very meditative. Now, I think you could maintain a very strict regulation with how you do digital photography in a way to make it more meditative, but I think it's very hard. It's like any sort of convenience of technology. A very great book on this that everyone should read is Plato's Phaedrus. I cannot stress how great this book is for so many problems modernity faces. I think I probably recommend it to someone every other day. But it relates very much here. I mean, the specific problem in that book is with writing, but it really is true with any technology. The basic gist of this myth that Plato gives to Phaedrus is the Egyptian king and all the Egyptian gods are coming to him, which I love. It's just so Egyptian. It's like, oh, the gods are like servant to the pharaoh. And so you have all these gods coming to the pharaoh to give him gifts, and Thoth comes along. And Thoth is the god of knowledge and writing and wisdom. And Thoth says, oh, Pharaoh, my gift will be so much greater than all the other gods. You will not even know how you survived without it before, which is very much this Promethean technological archetype you see, where it's like Prometheus gives the flame, Odin gives writing, Lucifer gives the ability to know good and evil, to discern between good and evil. It's a Promethean archetype. And so this Promethean figure in Thoth comes along and says, I will give you writing. And the Pharaoh thinks about it and he says, no. And so Thoth says, why would you not want writing? It's so great. You know, I'm giving it you for free 99. Why would you not want writing? and well, he says, well, when people write things down, they're taking the knowledge in their head and they're putting it on paper. So they're getting rid of knowledge. They're getting rid of wisdom. This seems like a very primitive way to think of it, but Plato's point basically is what we see now with things like the Google effect. And what this means is that when we are, I mean, even a village idiot for most of history could memorize poems that very literary, intelligent people struggle with to memorize the length of nowadays, because our minds have been so extradited to ulterior technologies that perform the function of memory that our brains did for so much throughout history. And we're practiced to memorize. We don't need to memorize even cell phone numbers anymore because we have cell phones that do that. I bet you'll find that if you take pictures a lot, you don't generally remember the vacations very well where you take the pictures. Our brain just unconsciously, passively puts memory into these other functions. It's like, well, I don't need to remember this because this device is going to remember it, so I'll just do something else with this energy, which just goes to watching TV or Netflix or video games. Anyways, I mean, we're just totally screwed. But the gist with photography, what it's doing here in this respect is that if you saw The Young Pope, this would be a good example. There is a scene where Jude Law, who's playing the Pope, and this public relations person for the Vatican comes in and says, like, all right, we got to get your image everywhere. We have these plates. We're going to do these like little, coffee mugs with your face on it. And he's like, no, God, no. What? And the idea there is that his point is like, I think he mentions like Daft Punk and like, who are all these, really cool, mysterious people that don't have their images shown. And his point is that the image, the lack of the image itself is desire. And that to not know exactly what something looks like draws us to it. We are drawn instinctually to mystery. Whether you're an atheist, agnostic, a Christian, a Buddhist, mystery is what encapsulates us. When we know too much about things, they tend to lose their interest. And indeed, and the people who are experts on things are still passionate about what they're passionate about, precisely because how much they know about it, they realize they don't really know much about it at all, right? So,
very Socratic.
Yes. Photography, more so than pretty much any other technology, in my opinion, has destroyed the sense of mystery that the ancient world has had. You would be a pious Catholic, and you wouldn't really know maybe who even the Pope was. You definitely probably didn't know what he looked like. Or you didn't know what the inside of the Hagia Sophia looked like if you were an Orthodox pilgrim. And you would go on these long journeys that costed a lot of time and money. You basically had to totally reconfigure your life path, which wasn't big back then as it is today. To go on this pilgrimage to see what the inside of the Hagia Sophia looked like. People were drawn in massive movements for an image that you had to physically go to that now we just take a few seconds on Google to find. We would hear words and stories about people and we wonder, what does this person look like? I mean, I don't know about you, but whenever I hear about someone interesting or something interesting, or I'm reading some author and I think what they're saying is very interesting, one of the first things I do, I Google them because I want to know their physiognomy. I want to know what they look like. There's a mystery in this, and I think that mystery produces an eros and a passion that we're just not really aware of anymore. And photography has made this pornographic. It's perverted this mystery, and that's why photography is very dangerous. And I mean, I'm not in any plausible sense a reactionary here. I don't think it's in any way possible to go back, unless some sort of post-apocalyptic scenario happened. We're doomed at this point. But it's a misery that I recognize all the less.
Do you think videography's the same, essentially?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So photography, videography all follow the same suit?
There's a really good essay by a Catholic film theorist, Andre Bazin. And I think, Jacob, you might have to look this up to verify that this is the right title. I think it's called The Hauntology of the Photographic Image, or The Mummification of the Photographic Image. And this essay is only 8 pages, so I definitely recommend you listeners go out and find it. I know it's a PDF online somewhere.
Yeah, so you can find it on JSTOR, which is basically like an open source article website. But yeah, it is the ontology of the photographic image.
We'll put a link to that in the bio.
And basically, Andre Bazin, I mean, so one thing that he kind of goes for is that all of reality itself is a film by God. We're surrounded by all these images in this 3-4 dimensional realm that we interact with visually, aesthetically, and that this is all a show put on by God, basically. When a artist is capturing that image in photography, they're reifying what God has already given us, but they're giving us a particular bias, which is to say this frame that we introduce to God's narrative. So instead of this is the world as I experience, I take a picture and now I'm reifying that image into the way that I experience it. So I'm reifying what God experiences to what I'm supposed to experience to what you're now experiencing through my imaging of God's experience. And Bazin's not really qualifying that in a good or bad way, but the point he's sort of making in that is this. And I mean, if anything, he's really seeing photography as the height of art, because he's saying photography more than any other art gives us God's view objectively. But at the same time, there's a certain caution for Bazin insofar that what we're dealing with is extremely sacred precisely because of this. An artist has no lies, and as a painter, for example, in the sense that what they're giving you is not reality. And this is why I appreciate in later modern art, modern being used very loosely here, things like the symbolist movement, because it's kind of like what I was saying earlier with how I admire pornography's honesty, literal pornography. Well, in the symbolist movement with art, you see a certain honesty. Like we're not the realist. When photography came out, painting was really affected because it was like, well, what do we do now? We're going to keep doing realist landscapes? Are we just going to paint portraits of people? Are we going to do like really bizarre, where you see now where it's just like, Jackson Pollock, things on a, scribbling whatever on the paintings. But the symbolist movement was more concrete in that they're giving you real images, but they're giving you symbols of reality, that take on these forms like a dream. And the photographic image is minimally edited. You adjust the f-stop, you adjust your shutter, you try to find which way gets the light so you have it cooked just right, and that's a sense of objective reality. And there's a certain sacredness and a certain responsibility that a photographer has that I don't think any other artist does. It's always the photographers that deal with the spirituality in everyday mundane existence that I most appreciate. People like Ralph Eugene Meetyard, who was in our own Lexington. And if you look at his images, he did a series of portraits of Thomas Merton, the monk, so I guess that's pretty overtly religious. But his other everyday photography, which are just people wearing masks, is usually disturbing.
It was very surreal.
Surreal,
Actually,
yes.
I don't know if it's still at the UK Art Museum, but it was there for a couple of years where you could go and visit his art, and it was very surreal looking at it. It was almost unreal with the masks, and he'd like to picture a lot of like ruined buildings or structures and whatnot.
Would you actually make an argument that sexual pornography, the literal pornography, as most people know that word, gets an unfair bad rap in contrast to other photography?
Yes.
Okay.
Because obviously the way that photography affects us psychologically negatively is pretty obvious. But most others photography, I mean, even photography that you see used for modeling, especially all the editing that they do and the way this affects people's body image, which is already capitalizing on the fact that people see desire as who they are, which is a whole nother thing I should probably talk about at some point. But I mean, this is extremely dangerous, and this is something that affects everyone. I mean, you can choose to avoid photography, but unless you want to go live off the grid, you can't really choose. You're condemned to suffer the pornography that is modern capitalism, basically. There's not an escape from the propaganda of the image on the billboard, the ads you see or whatever. And which in a certain sense actually makes it much more nefarious. At least with pornography, it's your own free will. But again, unless you want to just be Amish, you're basically condemned to the pornography of ideology.
Very propagandic,
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah. And as you know, Jacob, in the Freud class, we're eventually getting to Edward Bernays' Century of the Self.
Yes.
As the sort of culmination, along with the Unabomber's manifesto. And both of these pieces are, in some sense, using psychoanalysis, although for very different ends. The Unabomber is using psychoanalysis to criticize the world that Edward Bernays has built using psychoanalysis. So it's a good example of how psychoanalysis can be a two-edged sword.
It sounds very ironic and stupid of me to say, but have you watched the documentary about him?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
I've heard people know I like the Unabomber, so they're like, oh, there's a documentary that came out. I haven't seen it, but I might check it out at some point. Does it use real footage or is it like acted out?
I'm not 100% sure. I haven't seen it myself, but my brother said it was very good and very informative. I think it is somewhat dramatized.
I see.
But I think there are the real people, at least to some
And
level.
this came out recently, right?
Yeah, fairly
so
recently.
I think this is very interesting because one thing I'll say about the Unabomber in here today is that I think it was in his letter. It was not in the manifesto. He said something about how in 20 to 40 years, he's writing this in the 90s, that would really be the potential crashing point of the modern industrial complex. And that in order to counter that, they would have to come up with something that, one, isolates people, and two, isolates people from other people and makes them more technologically dependent. Which you're thinking about this and you're like, well, is that not exactly what COVID has done?